What is going on, Revolution Church? It's so good to see everyone this week. If you're joining us online, thank you so much for joining us. Hit that share button, tag somebody underneath, hit that like button if you're watching us on YouTube. We are so glad that you are with us. Hey, I want to update everybody on the facility before we go into week 3 of our series, Meaningless, on the book of Ecclesiastes. We had another great week of giving towards the property that we are buying last week. We took up $23,718 last week. So we are officially over $200,000 that we've raised for the $264,000 we need. Right now, we sit at $205,467.83. That means that we have $58,532.17 left to raise by July 1st. We close on the property on July 1st. It is not contingent on financing. We believe that we are going to raise every bit of it. And so we're at that last 10 to 20%. And so I just tell you guys, just keep praying about what you're supposed to do. If you've already given, I would ask you just to pray again. Ask God if you're supposed to give again. The last 10 to 20% of anything you do is always the hardest, and I don't think this is going to be any different. It's easy to kind of relax and try to just go, well, it'll come from somewhere. But remember, we're called to do it. Don't miss being a part of the blessing of this as we are seeking to leave a legacy in Tennessee and in Crossville. Well, we're in week 3 of a series called Meaningless, where we are going through what is my favorite book of the Bible, which is Ecclesiastes. I love this book of the Bible. It's written by Solomon, the same guy who wrote the Song of Songs we went through earlier this year, wrote Proverbs, and he writes it at the end of his life, and I love it because it's so real and it's so raw. I mean, you want a book on psychology, man, you need to read Ecclesiastes. If you ever get down about life or frustrated about anything in your life, you need to read Ecclesiastes. Week number 1, Jeff, who is our Rev Men's minister, opened up the series, did such a fabulous job opening it up. He told us really the basis of the book was really in chapter 1, and it was everything is meaningless. Week number 2, last week, Solomon started to give a testimony about some specifics that were meaningless based off chapter 1, and we really looked at how the American dream is meaningless. The name of the sermon last week was Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Misery. If you get more stuff, it's not going to make you happy. If you get more status and more ego and more respect and all these different things that Solomon talked about, it doesn't lead to fulfillment like we think it will. Well, this week, what we're going to look at is probably the most popular chapter of Ecclesiastes, and quite frankly, maybe one of the most popular chapters in the entire Bible, as we look at chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. And what we're going to see is Solomon talk about how time is meaningless. Now, this is the most iconic chapter in this entire book. This entire chapter was written into a song by a band named The Byrds. The song was called Turn, Turn, Turn. Many of you know it. If you're younger, you may not know it, but you've probably heard it at some point. But the entire song was Ecclesiastes chapter 3, with the exception of 6 words in the song. The whole thing was this secular, very popular band, very popular song. The whole thing was the book of Ecclesiastes. So we're going to start out in chapter 1. We really are going to go verse by verse through a few different seasonal things that he talks about. And then I've really got 2 points and a couple of lists for you at the end. I think we're really going to learn some stuff today. And it's going to be really, really good. You're going to see, though, this is all about time. 30 times in this chapter, you're going to see the word time used. So clearly that is the focus. Ecclesiastes 3, chapter 1. Solomon starts out by saying, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. I can remember about a month ago in Crossville, Tennessee, we had weird weather change take place. There was a couple weeks where it was like 85 degrees outside and sometimes got upwards of 90 when the sun was shining on you, if you remember that. And if you don't remember it, it's just kind of par for the course around here that we have crazy weather, right? But for about a week or two, we had like 80, 85 degree weather. It was sunny outside. It was beautiful. And then all of a sudden, for like 2 weeks, the bottom dropped out of it. And we were having like 50 degrees, 50, 55 degrees every single day. It was in the 40s at night. It was so crazy. And as a result of that, I got sick, and then my family caught the cold that I had. Thank goodness it wasn't a year ago. We weren't freaking out too bad, right? But as a result of the different seasonal weather changes that happen in Tennessee, you know, they always say if you don't like the weather here, just hang around a couple of days because it'll be totally different in a couple of days, and that's so true. And as a result of those changes, many of us, like, we get colds. And the reason we get colds and the reason we get sick is because, like, our bodies get used to one season of weather, 85-degree weather, and then all of a sudden it's 50 degrees, and we don't change our clothes. We're still wearing shorts. We're still wearing T-shirts, and we walk outside, and we get sick. What you're going to see as Solomon unpacks this is you better be ready to make some changes in your life when different seasons come. You better be ready when the cold comes in to change your clothes. Otherwise, you're going to get sick, and you're going to be miserable. In this opening verse, Solomon really uses seasons of weather to make the connection to the seasons of life that we all go through. God many times through the natural gives a glimpse into the supernatural, and the physical is really symbolic of the spiritual world. And this chapter of the Bible is really no different. We all go through different seasons of life, and when you get into a new season, you better be willing to change. I think I've told you guys this story before, but when I was 1 year old, my dad had bought a brand new pair of cowboy boots, and when I was one, and I was being potty trained at the time. And one day, my dad left his cowboy boots sitting out in the middle of the floor, and because I was being potty trained, I peed right in his boot. And the next day, when he went to put his boot on, he got a sock full of my pee. Now, because I was a kid, that was fine. That was a certain season of my life. But now I'm 41 years old. If I go to my dad's house now and pee in his boot, that is not just wrong, it's sinful, and I may go to jail. I don't know, but I've got to change is the point. Me and Titus, my son, who is just turned 10 years old, we hang out all the time. We have what we call dudes days, and I'll take him out, and we'll go hang out. We'll go to like a trampoline park, or we'll go watch a movie, and we'll go eat and stuff like that. And he's 10 years old, so I usually fit the bill for that, and we have a good time. Well, when Titus is 40 years old, I'm not going to be paying for everything. Our dudes days may look totally different if we have them at all, because he's no longer 10 years old, he's 40 years old. So you've got to change with every season is what Solomon is starting out telling us. You know, when you're 40 years old, you don't need to still be sitting at home playing video games, living in the basement. You need to have a career, you need to be doing something with your life, and this is the change. This chapter really is all about change. Now, he's opened up with this verse to set up the next 14 things that he's going to lay out to us to try to show us the difference in seasons and the extreme of seasons. So listen to what he says, and I'm going to stop at each one and just kind of explain it just to make sure we get it, because once again, this is written in Hebrew poetry. It can be kind of confusing sometimes, and I think we're going to get it, but I'm just going to make sure we do. So he says in chapter 2, after he talks about seasons, he says there's a time to be born and a time to die. And so he starts out with the line that says there's a time you're born and a time you're dead. And so everything he talks about, the next 13 points that he brings out, falls between this timeline of your birth and your death, okay? He says there's a time to plant and a time to uproot. He's saying there's a time to begin something, begin a family, begin a new job, begin doing something, and then there's a time to end something, a time when it is over. Verse 3, he says there's a time to kill and a time to heal. When he talks about killing here, I believe he's talking about self-defense, but I also believe that he could be talking about health. Some biblical scholars believe he's talking about health, and when he says heal, he's definitely talking about health. Some of you have been through seasons before where you were sick. And now, hopefully, you're in a season of healing and feeling better. And so he says there's a time to be sick, and there's a time to get over it and be better. He continues and says there's a time to tear down and a time to build up. What he's saying here is nothing lasts forever. You can build stuff. Hey, we're getting ready to build a facility. But if Jesus doesn't come back in 500 years, do you think that facility is going to be there 500 years from now? Don't feel bad about that. The Apostle Paul started churches all over in Asia, right? How many of them exist today? Everything comes to an end. Nothing lasts forever. Keep that in mind, okay, as we're going to get into these lists here in a minute. Verse 4, he says, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. So there's a time to be sad and there's a time to be happy. Some people struggle with the glass always being half empty and everything's negative and you're a victim and everything's always wrong and you can never get over the hump, and you need to understand that God does give you happy days. God will get you past mourning seasons, and He will, seasons that you're mourning is what I mean, not in the morning, but seasons that you are mourning. But then there's a whole other side of people that think you should be happy all the time. Happy, happy, happy. I should always be happy, and there should never be any sadness in my life. Well, this points out the very real truth that every single one of us are going to experience sadness. Every single one of us should experience happiness at some point. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh. He continues, says there's a time to mourn and a time to dance. You know, I've preached at funerals before, y'all, and I've preached at weddings before. And every time I preach at a funeral, I've never seen anybody dancing. It's always a time to mourn. Anytime I do a wedding, well, there may be some people that aren't happy, but they usually don't show it at the wedding, right? But every time I do a wedding, people are dancing. They're overjoyed. There's a time to mourn and there's a time to dance. He says there's a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. What he's talking about here is conflict. If you've ever seen news footage from third world countries whenever there is conflicts that are arising, you'll see people taking stones and throwing them at police or military. This is what he's referring to. There is a time for conflict and there's a time to prepare for conflict in your life. Now, some of us would say, I don't like conflict. I avoid conflict. I just want everybody to be happy. I want everything to be okay. But one of the things you will find if you are truly following Jesus, and the Bible speaks so much to this, and especially if you're going to have real relationships with people, you've got to figure out how to have conflict. It is unavoidable. If you're going to work anywhere, if you're going to be a part of a family, if you're going to be married, if you're going to have kids, if you're going to do anything that has to do with people, you better learn this truth, that conflict is coming and you need to prepare for it. He continues and says there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. It's interesting that right after he talks about conflict, he really is talking about relationships, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Now, some commentators think he's specifically talking about sex, and absolutely he is. You know, you embrace a man and a woman, born a man, born a woman. Once they are married in the eyes of God and become one, that is when you have sex, right? But he's also talking about not just that, he's talking about your relationships. There is a time where you will have some people come into your life and a time that those people will walk out of your life. More on that here in just a second. But there is a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to have relationships, a time to walk away from those relationships and refrain from them. It says there's a time to search and a time to give up. Boy, that's a real good one, isn't it? We have a Roku at home, and I bought 6 different remote controls for our Rokus. And for some reason, even though I have 6 different remote controls, I even attach these tiles to them that are Bluetooth that beep. We lose every single one of them. There's a time to search, and we tear the couch cushions up, and we try to find them everywhere. Most of the time, we give up. Thank goodness. We can control it on our phone now, so thank goodness, because It just make you lose your mind, right? And so anyway, a time to search and a time to give up. There's a time to keep and a time to throw away. Boy, what a great verse. You know, we talked about the American dream last week, and we talked about how much material possessions mean to so many of us, right? And how we get our status and ego from it. But here, Solomon is telling us there's a time to keep things and there's a time to throw things away. Some of us need to understand this verse just very practically, that there is a time to rent a storage unit and keep things, but there's also a time that you need to have a garage sale and get rid of them, okay? You know, that dress you wore in high school is never going to fit again. You need to get rid of it. Give it to somebody that'll use it. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a time to keep and there is a time to throw away. Verse 7, he continues. This is the 11th thing he's telling us to show this dichotomy. He says there's a time to tear and there's a time to mend. And what he's speaking about here is that in Hebrew culture and in cultures during this biblical time, when they were in mourning, they would tear their clothes. They would tear their clothes. You see, like, for instance, in the book of Jonah, the king of the Ninevites, he tore his clothes and he sat in ashes. We see, like if you ever watch The Passion of the Christ, you see that when Jesus was on trial, one of the Pharisees tore his robe, okay? That shows disgust or that shows mourning. But there's also a time when your mourning's over. Typically what they would do at this time is they would sew that tear back up to represent that the mourning time was over. Once again, sadness versus joy. There's a time to tear and a time to mend. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak. What a great verse. What a great verse, Rev Church. Some of you guys right now, you're watching us on Facebook. You're watching us on YouTube. Have you ever read the comments on YouTube videos? Man, there's a time to speak, but there is a time to shut up. If we just took this one verse and really prayed about it and really said, God, I want you to tell me when I need to be quiet, please. When I'm not supposed to speak, when I'm not supposed to comment, when I'm not supposed to put the angry face emoji on somebody's status, when I'm not supposed to give my opinion, when I'm not supposed to review that restaurant because I'm supposed to be a mirror of you and showing your image in this world and glorifying Christ through my life, please, please help me to understand this verse. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak. In other words, there's a time to comment, there's a time to post, there's a time to put something on social media, but most of the time you probably shouldn't, okay? It says this next. Two more. A time to love and a time to hate. But Josh, we're not supposed to hate. You better. God doesn't hate. God hates sin. And when you see sinful things, you need to have a righteous indignation rise up in you, and you better hate it. When we talk about child trafficking, you need to hate it. We talk about sexual abuse, you need to hate it. When we talk about adultery, you need to hate it. Okay, so there's a time to love, but there's also a time to hate. There's a time for war and a time for peace. Again, logically, here Solomon is saying, you know, there's a time for war and a time for peace. Some people would say we all need to be hippies and we need to sit around and sing kumbaya and hold hands and we just need to have world peace. And number one, when there's world peace, it means some end time stuff is cracking. You know what I mean? But so if you're a Christian and you say that, you need to know that something's coming around the corner that's even worse. But that is never going to be possible because we are flawed human beings. We live in a broken world. So Solomon says there's a time for peace, yes, but there's also going to be a time for war, and it's very clear. He continues, and when he continues in verse 9, really what he does is he sums up everything he said about time. And so look at what he says. He says, what do workers gain from their toil? I've seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Remember that verse. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Time. Interesting subject is time. Lots of philosophies have been written about time. But the best, in my opinion, can be found nestled right here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. let's look at time and let's see what the Bible has to say about it, okay? I want to give you 4 points that we need to understand about time. Number one, when it comes to time, we need to understand this, that no one can manipulate time. Well, God can manipulate it. He can make the sun stand still, right? God can, but no human being on this earth can manipulate time. God gives every single one of us the same amount of time. All of us have 24 hours a day. In those 24 hours, I want you to listen to something I read. Leslie Weatherhead calculated a schedule comparing a lifetime of 70 years to a schedule of 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. So he looked at a life, and based on living 70 years, based on your age, if you live 70 years, he said this is what time of day it would be relative to a 7 a.m. schedule to 11 p.m., okay? If you're 15 years old right now, according to that, it's 10:25. If you're 20, it's 11:34. If you're 25, it's past noon. It's 12:42. If you're 30 years old, it's already 1:51. If you're 35 years old, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. If you're 40 years old, it's 4:08. If you're 45, it's past quitting time. It's 5:16. If you're 50 years old, it's 6:25. If you're 55 years old, it's 7:34. If you're 60 years old, it's 8:42. If you're 65, it's 9:51. And if you're 70, of course, it is 11 p.m. And if you're over 70, according to him, you're living on borrowed time. It puts it in a little bit of a different perspective when we think of it in hours rather than years, right? About the brevity of life and how none of us can manipulate time. Secondly, time is perishable and it is non-renewable as a resource. Time really, if it was a commodity, it really is the most important commodity we have, but it perishes constantly. You know, you hear people say things like a very popular saying, time is money. No, it's not. Money and time are nothing alike. When you lose money, you can always go make more money, but when you lose time, you can never make more time. You can't manipulate it. It is perishing all around us. It is elusive. And time is very relative, really depending on your age. If you're young this week at Rev Church, most likely time seems to go by slow to you. You can't wait to get off work. You can't wait to do this. You can't wait to just graduate. You can't wait for this. But the older you get, it seems to be what Solomon's saying is the quicker time goes by. The older you get, like our senior saints at Revolution Church would tell us, y'all don't even know how fast it is. You're going to look up one day and you're going to be like, man, it went just like that. Time is perishable and it is a non-renewable resource. Thirdly, time is constantly being used up. And the impact of our lives are directly related to how wisely we use the time we have, since it is being used up. Listen to some of these statistics that I found in my study. In a lifetime, listen to this, you spend 6 months on average sitting at a stoplight. You spend 8 months looking at junk mail. 8 months of your life is spent looking through junk mail. You'll spend 1 year of your life, if you live to be 70 years old, looking for lost objects, those Roku remotes that you've got in the couch somewhere. A whole year of your life is spent looking for something that is lost. Why would Solomon say there's a time to search, but there's a time to quit? Because he's like, man, you're wasting too much time, right? 4 years of your life, on average, statistically, is spent doing housework, cleaning your house. 5 years of your life is going to be spent waiting in a line. 6 years of your life is going to be spent eating and drinking. I don't mind that one. Mine's probably going to be more like 10 years, but 5 years waiting in line, man, who wants to do that? 20 years of your life is going to be spent sleeping on average. 5 years of your life is going to be spent getting dressed. Ladies, this is why your husband's always rushing you. He's trying to get you to understand the biblical concept of time, how important it is. You don't need to take an hour. It always blows my mind. I'll get home from the gym, and my wife and kids have already been trying to get ready for like an hour. I get home from the gym, and I still get ready before them, and I'm sitting on the couch for 15 minutes waiting on them to get ready. It's crazy if any guys can feel me up in here. So, D, you know what I'm talking about? You don't know what I'm talking about yet. Where is D? Is he in here? Is he there? You know what I'm talking about? You're going to know soon when you get married, okay, D? So, anyway, 5 years getting dressed, that's crazy. 2.5 years of your life are going to be spent on bed rest because you're sick. 5 months of your life, listen to this, is going to be spent, on average, 5 months of your life is going to be spent tying your shoes. Flip-flop people, where are we at, right? I never tie my shoes, and that's why, right? It's wisdom, you know? How are we spending our time? How are we spending our time? Because it is constantly being used up. And I think one point that Solomon is trying to get across here is we need to be very mindful of how we are using our time. Because Solomon appears here to be looking back over his life and thinking to himself, I wasted some time. Fourthly, and this is a big one, this verse, you know, where Solomon says he has made everything beautiful in his time. He has also set the eternity in the human heart. Evangelists use this verse all the time for good reason. Because fourthly, time turns into eternity for every single one of us. For every single one of us. Listen to me. We've already seen in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon make this connection to death in life, right? Father Time is undefeated. He does no jobs for no one. Every single one of us in here, we're going to meet our Maker one day. And this is what Solomon is talking about. We will meet our Maker one day. I love that he makes this connection to how God makes everything beautiful in its time. And what a comfort for those of us that are here at Rev Church this weekend that feel like, man, when you talk about being happy, Josh, and having joy, there's no way. I've lost someone I really care about. My life is a mess. Everything is just crazy. And so he makes this connection to the beauty that we're all going to experience in eternity one day. Once again, we talked about this last week, that we have eyes as believers in Jesus that do not look at the world around us. We look upward to heaven. We look towards our ultimate home. He will make everything beautiful in its time. No matter where you're at this weekend, no matter what you've been through, no matter what you're struggling through, no matter what kind of mourning you're dealing with, depression you're dealing with, you can rest assured of this, that if you will focus on what will be, God will get you through what is right now. He will get you through. Eternity is coming for every single one of us. In verse 12, he switches, and I love that we are going to talk about this weekend, because in verse 12, we're really going to talk about the exact same thing we talked about last week, but from a totally different perspective. So listen to what he says in verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and do good while they live, that each of them may eat, drink, and does this sound familiar? If you were here last week, when we talked about contentment, this is what he's talking about, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. Translated, find contentment in life on this earth. This is the gift of God. Isn't it awesome? I mean, I don't know what you grew up in. Maybe you grew up in some kind of crazy legalism with a God that's always angry at you. But here Solomon is making very clear that God wants every single one of us to be content. He wants every single one of us to have joyful lives, to be fulfilled, and to know that we are loved and rest in His love. Now, last week in chapter 2, we took a look, when we talked about contentment, at people that look at what they've never had and the things that they think will make them happy if they get them, right? Solomon talked about houses and money and riches and all these different things. And so last week we talked about people that think about things that they don't have, and they think that those things are what's going to give them joy and satisfaction in their life. But here in chapter 3, Solomon is talking about people that are looking back at what they used to have and thinking if they could get what they used to have, then that's what would give them satisfaction, and that's what would give them fulfillment. It's contentment. It's the same concept, but a different angle. Last week was people that were discontent looking to the future. Typically, people that are younger, that look to the future and go, man, if I could just get this car, if I could just get this house, if I could just have this much money, if I could just have this job, if I could just have all this, then I'll be fulfilled. But this week, today, we're looking at people that are discontent because they keep looking at the past and wanting to relive it and wanting to go back to it, which typically, not all the time, typically is people that are a little more experienced and older in age, looking at the things that they've lost. See, this is where the rubber meets the road. When I was talking about change at the beginning of this sermon, the most difficult thing, I've sat thousands of hours with people in counseling sessions. I've answered tons of emails. I've had tons of phone calls with people. And by far, the hardest thing for people to deal with is change. 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 Again, people looking at what used to be, thinking if it was just the way it was, then I'd be satisfied. Here's the thing you need to know about time. Time always brings change. Nothing ever stays the same. This is Solomon's entire point in the first part of chapter 3. See, many of us are guilty of saying things like, I wish it was just like it used to be. Why can't it be the way it was? You know, it's not that we're control freaks, right? We're just thinking of a better time when things were better off, and why can't it be like it was? The people that struggle the most, and this is who Solomon's talking about, are the ones that try to make things the same year to year to year. But here's the problem. Your kids grow up, and they're not little kids anymore. They get older. You get older. You can't run like you used to. I've got a bald spot coming in on my head right now, and there is nothing I can do to keep that from happening. Why can't we do what we used to do? Why do you think plastic surgery is so big in America? I want to look the way I used to look. I think about stuff like performance-enhancing drugs. It's a big deal. There's a market for it. Why? Because we want to be able to do what we used to be able to do. Why can't it just be like it was? And here's the reality. What we're doing when we say those things is we are romanticizing the past. We call it nostalgia. So here's some things you need to know. Here's some things you need to know that I think will really minister to some of us. Number one, when it comes to contentment in life, listen to me, okay? Last week we talked about people that were struggling with contentment because they were thinking about the stuff they didn't have. This week we're talking about people that they kind of know that's empty, and so they want things to be the way that was, okay? Number one, you need to understand this. People change. People change. People grow up. People move out. People change. One of the hardest seasons that I've walked with people through is when their kids grow up, move out, they get married, and they I hear people say stuff all the time, and I do the exact same thing. Oh, man, I just miss when they were babies. There's a couple people in our church right now that have babies. And it's interesting to watch that when a kid's a baby, parents lose their minds. They lose their minds. The kid's attached to me. It won't leave me alone. It's always hungry. It wakes up in the middle of the night crying. Oh my gosh, they drive me nuts. I love my kids, but man, growing up is just such a pain. You remember the first time that your kid set their own seatbelt and you didn't have to do it for them? Do you remember when they got out of a car seat and it was just like one of the greatest days in your life as a parent, you know? But you know what we do when they get older? We look back and go, those were the best times. Those were the best times. No, they weren't. Solomon says, move on and enjoy the season you're in now with your older kids. Quit romanticizing what really wasn't that great anyway at the time, because you were discontented at the time too, and start recognizing, man, you got kids that are older, you can hang out with them now. Listen, people change. There's people in your life that if you're going to grow in the Lord, guess what's going to happen? They're not going to grow in the Lord and mature with you. And so when Solomon says there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, he means that. You get close to Jesus, you start living for Him. You don't need to hang around people that still party and act like they're in high school even though they're 40 years old. It's time to grow up and move on. You change and people change. Number 2, circumstances change. They do. Circumstances change. They never stay the same. People move. You move. People get married. People get divorced. People die. I can remember when Brooke and I first got married, one of our first apartments was in Knoxville, Tennessee, off Jacksboro Pike on Connor Drive. And we lived behind this big, huge house up this driveway in the basement of a garage that had been converted into an apartment. And this place that we rented was one of our first places, right? We started out small, right? Had a concrete floor. I think it had one bedroom. The toilet was about 6 inches from the washer and dryer that was right in front of the toilet. We were just happy to have a washer and dryer, but it was right in front of the toilet. And I remember, having to use the bathroom, you had to do gymnastics in order to do that. It was crazy. We would wake up in the middle of the night with these huge roaches that were on us. I remember one time I woke up and there was a bug on my face, and I grabbed it and I threw it against the wall, and it sounded like I threw a baseball against the wall. That's how big this bug was. And the next day we looked at it and it was laying there dead in the floor. It kind of splatted, and it was just this huge, huge bug. And it's so funny now, 21 years later, we look back at that first apartment and we're so nostalgic. We say, man, that was so great. God's blessed us with a home now. We got room. Man, we got a yard. It's so great, but we look back at that first apartment. Not that we're not grateful, but sometimes we look back at that first apartment and we say stuff like, boy, that was the good old days. Man, we were living on love back then, like Alan Jackson says, right? Boy, we miss those days. Solomon's saying, be real careful. Be real careful that you don't romanticize that too much and try to recreate it, because you can't recreate it, because circumstances change. Number 3, understand this. You need to change. You need to change. You need to mature in the Lord. None of us ever arrive. You need to accept the changes all around you. You need to move on. You need to get over it. You need to accept it. And then you need to enjoy life, have peace in your life, and have contentment in your life. Enjoy the toil under the sun that you have, even though you're in a different season. Don't lose your mind at Christmas and drive your family crazy because you want it to be the way it was 10 years ago when everybody would come over to your house, but now your kids are married and they've got their own kids and they've got multiple people to think of and they can't spend as much time with you. All that's going to do is push them away. Move on. You're in a different season. Support them in the season that they're in. I hope this is applicational and makes sense, because every young couple has been through this. Even you've been through it back when you went through it. Don't romanticize the past. Don't try to recreate things that are never going to be recreated. Don't lose your mind and freak out on people because they're not doing the things you used to have them do. Now you can't control them and they won't do what you want them to do like they used to. You need to change and have contentment. And fourthly, you need to rest in this. If this is your struggle, you need to rest in this. Fourthly, understand this. God never changes. God never changes. The stability in your life, the anchor in your life, the cornerstone in your life, the rock in your life should be Jesus. And you need to understand that He is your steady hand. When things seem out of control all around you, when things are frustrating, when there's too much change going on for you to be able to handle at once, you need to understand that God never changes. Solomon closes this passage by saying this: I know that everything God does will endure forever. Everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear Him. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. He says this in closing. This is that passage of Scripture that says there's nothing new under the sun. Whatever's been done in the past has been done again. You're not doing anything new. You're not chasing anything new. There's no new ideas. There's no new nothing. There's nothing new in this world. So what Solomon is saying is, stop focusing on this world. Instead, start to focus on heaven. Think about eternity. Stop stressing out about the seasons of life here and all the frustrations and everything you're dealing with here, and instead fix your eyes on Jesus. Fix your eyes, as the Scriptures say, on things above. The citizenship that you will one day have for eternity needs to be where your focus is. Don't get too caught up in the things of this world, because there ain't nothing new in this world anyway. Lord, we love you. We thank you so much for today. I thank you for every single person that is here. God, I thank you so much for the book of Ecclesiastes. I pray that this has ministered to people that are going through seasons of change in their life, and maybe they've been frustrated and upset and haven't known how to deal with it. God, you are our anchor. You're our rock. You're our steady hand. You're the cornerstone of our lives. So I pray, God, that we would lean on you when we're going through the things that Solomon talks about. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you guys so much for joining us online. We hope to see you really, really soon in person. We love you guys.